I love the idea that Vera van Valkenburg would be a secretly 214-year-old woman who's been presenting as mid-20s for all of these centuries. And
Who is Vera? Like, if you were introducing Vera to a class, like a class, who is she? Like, who was she back in her original time? And just if you,
And yeah, exactly. So she was originally born in like the Catskill Mountains in a small town to a Dutch family. And then something happened to her when she was in her 20s that made it such that she could no longer age or die. And after kind of realizing this, decided that it was dangerous to stick around in a small town with this type of condition. And she skipped town and has been, living a series of small lives ever since, kind of never staying in one place for more than 3 or 5 years, kind of thing. And that has been haunting her. And she decides to come back to her small town in the Catskills to figure out what did this to her so she can reverse her condition and finally be released. I got to know her while writing her. I'm one of those writers where the characters talk to me, where I will be surprised once I start writing. I'm like, oh, that's what happened to you. Or, oh, that's how you feel about your father. Or this is why you left Nebraska in 1861, or things like that. It feels, I don't know, that's that kind of magical muse-ish feeling. But the whole book I actually began as just a side distraction when I was working on a different manuscript and I was getting really frustrated with it. And I did like Jamie Attenberg's Thousand Words of Summer with a friend. And I was like, I'll just write this short story because this idea has been haunting me since I was 10. And I read Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt, which actually just turned 50 last year. And that's about uh, like a little girl who comes upon like a spring and then a family who has been kind of protecting it for years. And it was a really wonderful reading experience at, I want to say like 11 years old, kind of fifth grade. It was one of those first books that just startled me into the big moral questions of like, what would you do with an opportunity like this? And there were totally like boys in my class who were like, heck yeah, we would bottle it up and sell it. Like, who wouldn't like want to become a millionaire about it? And, it made for such good discussions. And the idea, basically the logistics of what it would mean, like the nitty gritty of living a life forever, haunted and delighted me and stayed with me for decades. And that was the itch I was trying to scratch with this short story that wound up being the first chapter. Because by the time I got to the end of it, I was like, oh, I have a whole thing. Oh, Vera has so much more to say. And so when I first started, I had no idea where she had been, other than I knew that she had been gone. And I liked the idea, so I moved up to this small town in the Catskills 12, 13 years ago. And there are these layers of what being a local means. And this is the same thing down in New York City, where like I was a local because I was born there. And my parents weren't because, they came from the Midwest or whatever. But even within that, there were fractions of fractions of this, and same with up here. Like my children were born here, but there are still Van Valkenburgs in the Catskills. Like that's a real town name, and I liked the idea of this character coming back as a newcomer, but she's ultimately like the secret super local. I mean, living in a town like this and, driving around, having friends and all the other little ones, I love how the layers of history all exist right on top of each other. And this happens in a city as well. It's just a little more kind of stark and quiet here where you can see like this road, so one of our friends lives in the old schoolhouse and it's right against the road. And people think it's crazy and it's that close. And it's like, well, this was once a dirt road and people didn't go that fast. And you wanted the schoolhouse right on the road because you wanted all the children to be able to access it easily. And it's in the middle of this valley because it was a central point. And I don't know, things like that. Like I loved, I don't know, basically taking I don't know, all these things that I had learned about this place and absorbed, they wound up it wound up coming out on the page in ways that I hope felt natural. It was very nice to not be, writing, especially with historical work, always takes some research as well. And you just got to be really careful to not let everybody see the strings at work because we've all read stuff where you're like, and here's all the research that I did about this era, and you can tell when writers work so hard and they don't want to let it go, and you're like, cool, cool. It's also like not serving the story, or that was the battle, or the creative challenge of taking what actually mattered to Vera and her family, and this story of moving back to a small town and all that.
Now, yeah, as supporting cast was, who else joins her on this journey that most entertained or was useful
Right.
to you?
Yeah, so she has her mother and her brother. This also happened to, um, and she's in the beginning of the story kind of currently slightly estranged from both of them because this was another thing I was thinking about. Where it's like, wow, like you think you have an intense relationship with your own family after 30, 40, 50 years. Like what about 200 years? Like how much does that heighten? And would your sense of time expand such that when you're like, oh, we haven't talked in a couple months, would that be the equivalent when you're 180 of like, oh, we haven't talked in 5 years? uh, that type of perspective. But other characters too. She Vera goes back to her actual like homestead, that the farmhouse that her like Dutch-born parents built in the year 1800, and then she is renting like a little Airbnb cabin in the shadow of it, and in that farmhouse is a young couple from Brooklyn who are looking to open a business, and that was very fun to kind of draw upon a lot of my personal experience of what that was like as well. So this book takes place around like 2015-ish. So at this point, there have been huge developments in short-term rental laws and other things like that. I'm really fascinated about how people romanticize what is wild, and what is untouched, and how people rewrite history all the time. Whereas there has been, like, people have been, the idea would be that Vera's family came and displaced indigenous people. And then, like, within the first, like, handful of five Dutch families, they were probably all annoyed at, the Larsens who finally like also built a church or opened the general store, or maybe one store was good, but two stores was too many, or like people are always conflicted about change, and yet change is deeply inevitable. And I think it's interesting when you talk about it within a community and people, and how you should be making laws for guidance, like, because otherwise you're just looking at this becoming a capitalist nightmare. But especially in the natural world, like, for example, a lot of the forests around here in the Catskills Park are forever wild, and that means you can't touch them. But like we've seen with, the fires in Los Angeles and things, like historically, there have been natural fires, or there have been communities that took out the underbrush that, so if there was a small fire, the whole thing didn't go up in flames. Or, during the 1800s, people had like all of these hills around us, like where I live, they were pastures. You can see kind of old drawings or old photos of it, and it seems wide open. And then, in the 30s, there were work projects where people were planting trees, to replace a bunch of the ones that had been used to build buildings for firewood, for tanneries as well, especially during the Civil War and all that. Um, and people come up and they're like, "Oh, what a like beautiful old romantic forest! Like it must be hundreds of years old." And I'm like, like 80 years old. Like it's not, and it's not, which is not to say it's unnatural, but like nature changes as well. And I loved the idea of having Vera have this perspective that I think no human actually has, to watch on this several hundred-year scale, how the natural world changes.